Hello and welcome. I'm Professor Sharon Ruston of the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University. I'm going to talk to you today about Frankenstein. I've just written a book on Frankenstein, so I'm going to give you an excerpt of that. And the book really focuses on the science of life and death in Frankenstein. So as a content warning, I do talk quite a lot about death and suicide and things like that. And I'm going to tell you a lot about Mary Shelley's real life and the things she encountered in it. Okay, so Mary Shelley experienced more than her fair share of death. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, died only 11 days after giving birth to her. She had to live with the fact that her birth had inadvertently caused her mother's death. She grew up without a mother to help and guide her through life, just as the creature in Frankenstein is abandoned by his creator. Thereafter, deaths quickly followed births in a horribly predictable fashion in Mary's life. She eloped, aged 17, with Percy Shelley. He was 22 at that time, already married and a published poet. Their brief life together was fraught with bereavements, money worries, fears that he would be in prison for debt, and anxieties about his health. Life and death were subjects on Mary's mind throughout this time. Back in England, after eloping to the continent, Mary's first child was born prematurely on the 17th of December 1815 and died on the 6th of March. She was successfully delivered of baby William on 24th of January 1816. William was with them for the momentous trip to Geneva, where Mary conceived Frankenstein. Mary's stepsister, Claire Clairmont, accompanied the Shelleys when they eloped, and in Geneva the Shelleys and Claire spent their days and nights with Lord Byron and his doctor, John Polidori. On their return again to England, Claire gave birth to Allegra, Lord Byron's child, on the 12th of January 1817. But news of death soon followed. On the 9th of October 1817, Fanny Imlay, Mary's half-sister, the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft and Gilbert Imlay, committed suicide by overdosing on laudanum. A few months later, Mary and Percy heard that Harriet Shelley, Percy's first wife, had killed herself. She had been found drowned in the Serpentine River, pregnant, on the 10th of December. Mary and Percy married soon after, on the 30th of December, but Percy was refused custody of his two children by Harriet because his publications were considered blasphemous and seditious. Mary was pregnant during the composition of Frankenstein, which she finished just before she gave birth to Clara Everina on the 2nd of September 1817. She referred to the novel as her hideous progeny and her offspring, and it focuses on issues of creation, life and death. Mary could not have known at this point that there was so much in sadness still left to experience. Clara died on the 24th of September 1818, only a year old, and William on the 7th of June 1819, aged 3. The Shelleys' only surviving child, Percy Florence, was born on the 12th of November 1819. Claire and Byron's daughter, Allegra, died on the 22nd of April 1822, aged 5. In June 1822, Mary had a near-fatal miscarriage herself. Percy, of course, drowned on the 8th of July 1822. Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein emerged from a climate of fear. Life was a tenuous state of existence, and death an ever-present possibility in those times. As scientific knowledge increased, and as new resuscitation techniques were widely reported, the public worried that the distinction between life and death was not as clear as had been thought. There was a real concern that doctors might not be able to tell with any precision when very ill people were alive or dead. People worried that they may be buried alive, or that their corpses would be robbed from their graves for use in medical experiments. So I'm going to talk about how Mary Shelley exploited the uncertainty caused by the new scientific and medical ideas of life and death, and how this explains why Frankenstein continues to produce disquiet and unease even after 200 years since its first publication. So first I'm going to talk about the life and death of Mary's first child. Even before she had thought of the novel, Mary had experienced birth and death and the slippery divide between them. She was very unwell during her first pregnancy, complaining of, quote, a very bad side ache on Christmas Day in 1814. We know all this from her journals because she kept journals throughout this time. She consulted a doctor called Lawrence on the 26th of December. On the 5th of January 1815 she was, quote, very ill, and on the 12th of January she was very unwell, and on the 6th of February she was not well and went to bed early. Perhaps Mary had an inkling that something was not quite right with her pregnancy, given the state of her health. For 2 months she recorded feeling unwell in her journal. At the same time she noted that Percy was very ill at the end of January, and on the 14th of February she writes, all unwell in the evening. The entire household was ill. A few days later, on the 17th of February 1815, Mary gave birth. Percy recorded Mary's labour in the journal that they shared, writing that it was accompanied by, quote, very few additional pains. Dr. Clark had arrived 5 minutes after the birth. Extraordinarily, he may have been the brother of the doctor who attended her mother's disastrous labour. Percy wrote in their journal, all is well, May, which is his pet name for Mary, perfectly well and at ease. The child is not quite 7 months. The child not expected to live. S, which is Percy, sits up with May, much agitated and exhausted. It is baffling that such a situation could be summed up with his beginning with, all is well. No, it doesn't sound like things are well. The slide from birth to expected death was fast, as is the change in Mary being considered at ease to being agitated and exhausted. The days thereafter were marked by the child's persistent clinging to life. The next day Percy wrote, the child unexpectedly alive, but still not expected to live. On Friday the 24th of February, the child exhibited favourable symptoms, and the parents began to indulge in hopes, which Dr. Clark confirmed. While the child and Mary continued well though, Percy was very unwell and exhausted, culminating on the 26th of February, the first day that Mary had risen from her bed, with Shelley has a spasm. Percy would have these convulsive fits throughout their life together, often at times of stress. He traced their source to an episode in Tanil Alt in Wales in 1813, when he claimed to have been injured by an intruder. Despite seeming improvement and entries in the journal that record her nursing the baby, the devastating journal entry for 6th of March reads, "Find my baby dead." The effect on Mary's mental health is clear. She is not in good spirits. She wrote immediately to Thomas Jefferson Hogg, Percy's friend, and told him that she needed him, rather than Percy, because, quote, "You are so calm a creature, and Shelley is afraid of a fever from the milk, for I am no longer a mother now." That evening there is, quote, "a fuss," which resulted in a late night, to bed at 3. Percy was worried about so-called milk fever, which supposedly began a few days after mothers had begun to lactate, as we know Mary had recently done. Mary's breast milk had built up, but there was no baby to feed. In this instance, becoming a mother and losing the child has the potential to endanger her own life. The next days of her journals contain many heart-wrenching entries. For example, "Still think about my baby. 'Tis hard indeed for a mother to lose a child." In a letter to Hogg, she gave more information on the circumstances of the baby's death. Apparently she had risen in the night to nurse her, but did not because she appeared to be sleeping so soundly. She realised with hindsight that her baby had been already dead at that point, and added that, from its appearance, it evidently died of convulsions. Throughout the entries, Mary most often referred to her new daughter as my baby, while Percy speaks of the child. But Mary also refused to gender the baby female in the journal, instead always referring to it rather than her. And she never uses the name of the child in the journal. It's a strange prefiguring of the creature in Frankenstein, who, while being gendered male in the novel, is often thought of as an it by others, and who is never named. Looking back over the journal entries, it seems clear that the baby's frail and vulnerable start in life had seemed to improve before life was cruelly and suddenly taken away. The boundary between life and death is indeed thin in such cases, and the ease with which a new life can be lost is troubling. Immediately after the death of her child, Mary began to read Ovid's Metamorphoses in Latin. She continued throughout April and May, noting the number of pages she construes each day. In Metamorphoses, there are many instances of figures being transformed just before death into other forms with new lives. Changes in states of existence have been on her mind, since she writes at the end of this journal, which is finished around this time, I begin a new journal with our regeneration. This period, so well documented in Mary's journals, gives us an insight into how much Shelley's lives were consumed by poor health. Years later, Mary recorded in a note that around this time, Percy had been diagnosed as dying rapidly of a consumption, but treatment advised by their doctor, William Lawrence, made him feel much better. In 1817, Percy was again consulting Lawrence, who advised him to stop writing poetry because it excited his nerves too much, and to travel to the warmer climate of Italy. Throughout his life, Percy suffered from periods of intense pain, which were diagnosed at different times as hepatitis, nephritis, and ophthalmia. Perhaps his own physical suffering partly explains his lifelong interest in medicine, having briefly considered it as a profession after he was expelled from the University of Oxford. Lawrence's edict was the reason that the Shelleys travelled abroad again after their elopement. In many ways, he was the reason behind that fateful trip to Geneva. So now I'm going to tell you a bit about the science of the times. The most immediate inspiration for Mary's novel occurs in mid-June 1816 in Via Diodati, Geneva, the house that Byron and Polidori had rented, while the Shelleys and Claire Clairmont rented another nearby. The weather was awful, and as a consequence they were forced to stay indoors and amuse themselves by telling ghost stories. One night, as Mary Shelley remembers it years later, she sat listening to Percy and Byron discussing the nature of the principles of life and whether there was any probability of it being discovered and communicated. At the time, Polidori wrote in his diary for 15th of June, Shelley and I have a conversation about principles, whether man was to be thought merely an instrument. The subject was a topical and controversial one, and it sparked Mary's famous creation. The exact topic of these conversations could have ranged over a number of new fascinating developments in science and medicine. In her 1831 introduction to the novel, Mary mentions galvanism, which was then understood as a kind of unique electricity that living animals possessed. Her journal shows that she had attended a lecture given by André-Jacques Garnerin on electricity, the gases, on the 28th of December 1814. Also in this introduction, Mary refers to spontaneous generation, the idea that microscopic animalcules seem to emerge from nothing in rotting meat. Though she does make light of the idea, and it seems to accept that life could not really materialise in this way. Debate on the nature of life was raging at precisely this time between John Abernethy and William Lawrence in the Royal College of Surgeons, so Percy Shelley's doctor. Abernethy made claims for electricity being the vital principle, while others claimed that the vital principle was oxygen or blood. The question of what life was consumed the scientific and medical worlds in Britain at this time and spilled out into the public sphere. Polidori was particularly well qualified to speak on the topic. He had studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh and written his third-year dissertation on sleep disorders. Such studies led people to believe that animation could be suspended, that there were states of being between life and death. Certainly, Victor Frankenstein boasts that life and death were to him merely ideal bounds, which he found a way to break through. So now I'm going to tell you about the Royal Humane Society. We can glean evidence of Mary Shelley's medical knowledge from the novel itself. The Humane Society, which became the Royal Humane Society in 1787, was set up to promote advice to the public on how to revive people who had experienced a life-threatening accident. The society thought that the treatments it advocated were particularly suited to those who had drowned or suffocated. The success of their work, resuscitating people from near death, fostered a new anxiety about being buried prematurely. This frightening situation was exacerbated by the kinds of advice being disseminated by medical professionals at the time. It was widely agreed that there were two kinds of death, incomplete and absolute. If you were unlucky to suffer the latter, absolute death, there was a real chance that your body would be dug up and sold by grave robbers for medical demonstration after you had been buried. So I want you to pause the lecture now and to go off and find out about the Humane Society online. You can just Google Royal Humane Society, and I'm particularly interested in you finding out about their medals and the Latin inscription on the medal. Okay. So there is a tangible link between Mary and the Royal Humane Society. While still grieving his wife's death in 1798, her husband, William Godwin, published memoirs of her life that were very frank and shocking to the point of scandal. He mentioned Wollstonecraft's 2 suicide attempts in June and October 1795. Her lover, Gilbert Imlay, had proved unfaithful to her and refused to set up home with her. She was terribly unhappy. Wollstonecraft told Imlay that she was buried alive and in a living tomb without him. In the letter that accompanied her second suicide attempt, she wrote, if I am condemned to live longer, it is a living death." On this occasion, Wollstonecraft threw herself off Putney Bridge into the Thames River. She was saved by strangers, and a letter written to Imlay suggests that she was revived using Royal Humane Society methods. So she wrote, "I have only to lament that when the bitterness of death was past, I was inhumanly brought back to life and misery." Before the event, she had been dreading this outcome. "I go to find comfort, and my only fear is that my poor body will be insulted by an endeavour to recall my hated existence, So we can only wonder what means they tried in the effort to bring her back to life. Mary Shelley's knowledge of the Royal Humane Society techniques can be seen in the novel Frankenstein and in her personal journal. So the entry for 19th of March 1815, after her first baby had died, reads, "Dreamed that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold and that we rubbed it by the fire and it lived." This is exactly what the Royal Humane Society and others recommended in such cases. They also claimed that such measures had very great hopes of success. The much publicised success of the Royal Humane Society made deaths all the more poignant. The society suggested that it was within an individual's power to save potential victims. Percy Shelley mentioned the Royal Humane Society in his notes to his poem Queen Mab. He wrote, "The Humane Society restores drowned persons, and because it makes no mystery of the method it employs, its members are not mistaken for the sons of God." His tone here is scientific. Percy favours the Society's methods, to the miracles that Jesus allegedly performed when he raised people from the dead. Those are shrouded in mystery, whereas the Royal Humane Society openly promoted its methods for the recovery of those apparently drowned. Despite this, many people at the time thought that there was something sacrilegious about seeming to raise the dead. With the Royal Humane Society proclaiming their successes so loudly and widely, did people feel responsible when they could not save their loved ones? The society claimed that they were able to bring people back from the dead. Percy seemed to share this idea when he wrote in 1819 of Dr. Bell, who had attended the Shelleys' son William during his last illness. He writes, "By the skill of the physician, he was once reanimated after the process of death had actually commenced, and he lived 4 days after that time." Whereas we would say that poor William took a little longer to die than was originally predicted, Percy seems to think that he has died and then is brought back to life temporarily. Although the word resuscitation was available to Mary Shelley to use at this time, in Frankenstein she tends to use the language of life being lost and then restored. So there are a number of occasions in the novel where characters faint, and I'd like you to pause the lecture now and go away and have a think about which characters faint in the novel, and then if you can, find those episodes in the book and have a look at the language that's used to describe those fainting episodes. Okay, so losing consciousness at this time was widely considered a state of suspended animation. When Victor Frankenstein creates his creature, he collapses and is described as lifeless. In this instance, it's his friend Henry Clerval who restores him to life. Elizabeth Lavenza faints on seeing the corpse of William Frankenstein. She fainted and was restored with extreme difficulty. When she again lived, it was only to weep and sigh, is how the novel puts that. This language suggests that while Elizabeth is unconscious, she is deemed to be dead. And this is the language of the Royal Humane Society, who claims that because of their methods, quote, upwards of 150 persons may with the strictest propriety be said to have been raised from the dead. Decades after the publication of her novel, when people realised that Mary had written it, because of course the first edition was published anonymously, Mary recalled being asked repeatedly how I, then a young girl, came to think of and to dilate upon so very hideous an idea. Most people thought that Percy had written Frankenstein when it was published, not least because of its subject matter, which was not considered appropriate for a girl of 18's conception. The novel's central idea that a living being could be artificially created and animated was a live scientific issue at this time. How could a young girl have had the necessary knowledge to write such a book? There were still not yet female physicians, although Mary Wollstonecraft had hoped that there would be in the future. But Frankenstein broached the science of life and death with confidence and insight. Its topicality is demonstrated by one contemporary reviewer declaring that the novel had, quote, an air of reality attached to it by being connected with the favourite projects and passions of the time. So, to conclude, I choose to call the unnamed being to whom Frankenstein gives life the creature, following many other recent critics of the novel. The term seems to me so much more positive than monster, and in any case it is Frankenstein who labels the creature a monster, and he is undoubtedly biased. The creature perhaps is monstrous though, in a number of ways. He transgresses the limits of the individual by being made up of many bodies, both animal and human. The dissecting room and the slaughterhouse furnished his materials. He is both living and dead, a living being made up of corpses. he is also, it seems, hideously ugly and gigantic. Rather than think of him as subhuman, though, it's possible to think of him as post-human. He can be seen as an improvement upon humans, more agile, vegetarian, able to survive in the Arctic wastes and in South American heat more confidently than we would be. The narrative structure of the novel means that no single narrator is given preference. The novel starts with a series of letters from Captain Walton to his sister, who has the same initials as Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, whilst they're on a dangerous expedition to the Arctic. And of course, Mary calls the youngest brother of Victor Frankenstein's William, which is the same name as her own child. When he meets Frankenstein, we hear his story told to Walton, and within that we hear the creature's story. The only times these frames are breached is when Walton comes face to face with the creature after Frankenstein has died. Frankenstein tells Walton that he created a living being, though he refuses to tell him exactly how. The creature, spurned and rejected by everyone he encountered, proceeds to murder Frankenstein's younger brother William. Who, of course, as I've said, has the same name, same first name as Mary's then living child, William. The creature also murders Frankenstein's friend, of course, Henry Clerval, and his fiancée, Elizabeth Lavenza, in revenge. The second and third murders come after Frankenstein destroys a second being he has agreed to create as a companion for the friendless and unloved creature. So I've chosen to focus on the first printed edition of Frankenstein, published in 1818, because this version contains more science. By 1831, the third edition of the novel, it has become more overtly Gothic. I've focused on the contemporaneous scientific explorations of life and death that influenced Mary Shelley's novel in this talk, rather than considering life and death as Gothic themes. I do not mean to suggest that Mary Shelley thought solely of scientific and medical ideas when she wrote the novel. In fact, I'm sure that that's not true. But I'm interested in the many current scientific and medical theories and discoveries that potentially contribute so much to this novel. Perhaps because there was such an interest in these themes, many others wrote poetry and prose about life and death in this period. But Mary Shelley's book has surely been the most influential. Thank you very much.